Good evening, everyone. We might get going. We're about 5 minutes after the starting time, but on the opposite side, geographically, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Jane Addis, Councillor Susan Bigger, and Councillor Victor Franco. I acknowledge also in the chamber tonight, to my left, is Mr. Brian Wee, Coordinator Governance. Oh, you're more than coordinator, yes, I haven't changed that. And to my left, Director of Urban Living, Mr. Scott Walker, welcome. There are a number of other officers in the chamber tonight, and we'll introduce those as they come up to give their reports. So generally, the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on Council's YouTube to enable public viewing of the proceedings. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council YouTube when it is practicable to do so. The primary purpose, as you probably know, of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with matters under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. For those present this evening, when we come to your agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer, and then we will call you up to come forward to the front. If you are making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said, and keep the submission that you're making focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to a planning application, please tell the committee why you disagree and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or details in the officer's report. There is a strict limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, and that includes councillors. And whilst as chair I can vary the time, it is custom and practice not to do so. At the 2.5 minute mark, I will make a ring with a bell, which indicates you have approximately 30 seconds left to complete your presentation. For those in the gallery this evening, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you to extend due courtesy.
I'd like to confirm them subject to a correction, if you wouldn't mind.
Can we do that at this point in time? Yes. Okay.
Would you like me to spell out what that is?
Please do.
On page 19 of 22, the vote, it has affirmative and negative, and it has myself and Councillor Franco as negative, and we abstained from that motion, and that's not recorded as such. So I'd be happy to confirm them subject to that correction.
Thank you.
I'd go further and say the minutes are incorrect in their...
Thank you.
I'd go further and say the minutes are incorrect in their suggesting we voted in the negative when we abstained.
We have recorded that as well, Councillor. Thank you.
And I think it needs to be corrected. So I'll support the motion subject to the amendment.
You're wishing to second the motion?
Yes, as long as it includes that correction.
Terrific, noted. Thank you very much. Councillor, is there anyone opposed to the motion? None. I'll put the motion to the vote. All of those in support? Unanimous. Thank you very much. I declare the motion carried. Declaration of conflict of interest. Councillors and council officers, are there any conflicts of interest that you wish to foreshadow at this point in the agenda? None? Thank you. We'll proceed with the agenda. So we can move directly into the main body of the meeting, to item 3.1, Baldwin and Baldwin North Heritage Study Peer Review, Stage 3, Outcomes of the Public Exhibition and Request for Panel, Amendment C398. Tonight, the officer presenting a report on this is Mr. Christian Williamson. Kristen, if you'd like to proceed, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers. and members of the community attending. The purpose of this report is to inform the Urban Planning Delegated Committee of the outcomes of the public exhibition process for Amendment C398, which relates to the Balwyn and Balwyn North Heritage Peer Review stage. The amendment proposes to include 18 individually significant properties in the Heritage Overlay. 17 of those were identified in stage 3 of the peer review, and there's one additional property from a separate heritage citation prepared for 25 Burrows Road in Balwyn. Following authorisation from the Minister in August 2023, the amendment was exhibited from the 9th of October to the 14th of November 2023. In response to the call for submissions, 12 submissions were received. This includes 7 submissions that oppose the amendment and 5 that support the amendment. A summary of the feedback that we've received and the officer's response is provided in attachment 1 of the report. Council's heritage consultant has reviewed the submissions and officers have reviewed the submissions. No changes are recommended to the amendment as a result of the feedback received. It is recommended that Council request the appointment of an independent planning panel and that all submissions are referred to the panel for consideration. The panel will hold a public hearing and all submitters have the opportunity to present at the panel hearing, and the panel will then come back with recommendations to Council. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. We have some submissions from the gallery tonight. We have 5 people wishing to make submissions. We understand that 3 are against the motion as it stands and 2 in support. Once I have announced your name, if you'd please come forward and sit at the head of the horseshoe table. If I call out a name and that submitter isn't there, I'll move directly on to the next submitter. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you again that you have a strict limit of 3 minutes, and I'll remind you at the 2.5-minute point. You need to commence your submissions with your name and the suburb in which you live only. So, if I could call first to Mr. Jim Lotus.
So good evening, my name's Jim from Balwyn North. So I'm opposed, or we'd rather see the amendment not go through. Essentially, in the officer's report...
Excuse me, can we just get you to speak right into the microphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the officer's report, we're told that the assessment is consistent with the objectives and planning of Victoria detailed in sections 4-1D of the Planning and Environmental Act. That being to conserve and enhance those buildings, areas and other places which is of scientific, aesthetic, architectural and historical interest or otherwise of special cultural value. So the council and I'm assuming then that the council and the Urban Planning Committee must also act according to this act. So I'm here to remind you of that. And section 12-2C of the Planning Act says, in preparing and planning a scheme or amendment, a planning authority must take into account its social effects and economic effects. The social and economic effects can be ignored by the Heritage Report as it's outside its scope. However, the effects must be taken into consideration by the planning authority. So firstly, the social effects. Now, we're consistently seen throughout this whole process that the feedback received is very small in number. Once again, following the public display of the Heritage Report, Council received only 12 submissions. Given that the 2021 census showed nearly 168,000 residents in Boroondara, this equates to only 0.007% of the community responding. To suggest that this amendment would have a positive social effect on the community is ridiculous. Rather, the lack of community engagement shows how inconsequent this amendment is to the community. The feedback for support of the amendment is more to do with the community voicing their concern with the replacement of existing homes with McMansions or inappropriately designed and supersized houses rather than the significance of post-war houses. This new breed of housing has dramatically changed the landscape of neighbourhoods by not respecting pre-existing heights and setbacks, and the community would be better served by council addressing these matters instead. Now, as far as the economic effect is concerned, economically speaking, the heritage overlay invariably is negative to the homeowner. Everything has a finite life, and houses are no exception. So coupled with the fact that most post-war houses are poorly built, in part due to building practices at the time, standards and materials available at the time, being forced to maintain a property beyond its inevitable use-by date for some perceived benefit to the community is grossly unfair. We can see this in the case of 25 Burrows Road, Balwyn, where the owner's unable to sell his place and stuff like that, and is taking a huge loss. So basically, I'm asking you guys to put yourselves in our shoes, and when making your decisions, imagine sort of the frustration and the fear that we're feeling and the stress being subjected to all this with no council, with no community benefit. So
Thank you, Mr. Alonso. I'd like you to wrap up now if you could. That'd be great.
lastly, precedent's been set by Maribyrnong Council, which chose to abandon its heritage amendment, acknowledging that heritage protection of homes can make repairs, renovations and financing complicated and has a negative impact on existing homeowners.
Thank you, Mr. Loutas. We need to wrap up now. Thank you very much. If you could stick with your seat, and I'll check with my colleagues whether there's any questions of you. Councillors, do you have any questions? Thank you very much. You can return to your seat.
Thank you.
I'd like to call now Mr. Gregory Ball to come and join us at the table.
Good evening. I urge the Planning Delegated Committee to abandon amendment.
Can we just start with your name, which I know we know, but if you'd start with that and your suburb, that'd be good. Thank you.
Gregory Ball, Balwyn North.
Thank you.
I urge the Urban Planning Delegated Committee to abandon the amendment. I've looked at several houses on the list, and in my opinion, not one of them is worth preserving. In my opinion, there's only one house in Balwyn North worth preserving, and that's not on the list. The Robin Boyd house is not on the list, but I do not consider that worth preserving. And I have some comments on process, elaborating on what the past speaker said. Property ownership is a bundle of rights, and if these rights are substantially taken away, then the value of the property is taken away. In fact, the property is essentially being stolen from the owner. And the owner should be properly compensated for the loss. In the report, staff made the comment that a heritage designation for a single house can sometimes increase the value of the house. They should provide, I think, realistic examples of that being the case. Almost always, in fact always, in my experience, it significantly devalues the house. And if someone cannot replace an existing house in Balwyn North, that diminution of value can be hundreds of thousands and even go up to $2 million. It's not insignificant at all. Also, I think historically it's important for you to mention one example. Now, I'm recalling this from several years ago, but a lady approached the city because she wanted to purchase a property, demolish the house and build a new one. The council said there are no restrictions on that, you can do it. As soon as she bought the house and submitted the plans to the council, they said, well, we're going to declare this a heritage district, so you can't do what you want. And the council talked to all of the owners in the area, and no one wanted this, so they reduced the heritage district to one property, hers. And she applied to the council to get rid of that heritage designation. They refused, and I remember the comments at that meeting. Council didn't know if it was legal, but they said she could go to VCAT and work it out there. So,
Point of order, Chair. I think this submitter is straying into dangerous territory as far as the reputation of the council and officers is concerned, and I would suggest be cautioned on that.
Thank you. I think Mr. Ball has finished his presentation at this point in time.
that's correct.
Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter tonight? Thank you. Mr. Ball, you can return to your seat. I call next Mr. John Briggs to join us at the table.
So I'm John Briggs. I'm a heritage consultant acting on behalf of the owner of the property in 1 Caravan Street, Balwyn.
Could you also mention your residential address? It's a procedural.
I'm in Port Melbourne. So
Thank you very much.
So the issue is that this is clearly going to go to panel if you choose to send it down that path. There's clearly for me a series of issues that are not yet explained to the point that there's clear understanding and a lack of contention, if you like, in terms of what's contentious. So we need to be able to have this fundamental basis of understanding present and clear from the heritage consultants that you've employed. In Maroondah, very recently, panel 148, looking at the contemporary homes area, has found very unequivocally that houses of this period, when they're rendered and altered in what GML has said is a superficial fashion, no longer have the significance. So they've excluded a series of these houses from the estate or from the group, it's a group listing, on the basis that they rendered and have changed their character to a degree that they no longer, if you like, complete to meet a threshold that goes beyond interest but to actual significance. I disagree with GML that in their report it's not necessary to establish what group of people or for the group of people for whom the house is, this particular property might be significant. They do re-express the Doug Wade case finding, which says that it's not for the purists, it's not for people like me or GML to say, I'm interested in this building, or for Built Heritage, who is very interested in these buildings of this period. That's an interest. Significance needs to be demonstrated, and the test here is the threshold of integrity. And this is a building that, whilst it's clearly built in the period, has been so altered that the character, in my view, is very likely not to get up. And the question is, can we resolve this now, at least to the point of understanding exactly what the differences are? Could you defer it and go through this exercise, or do we just spend all the money on people like me fighting it out with panel, which is essentially, in my view, kicking the process down the road? So I think that's the concern. I think on parallel panels, there's clear demonstration that the changes that have occurred have been sufficient to disqualify. I think we should be looking at it now rather than just proceeding to expend.
Thank you, Mr. Briggs. If I just check if any of my colleagues wish to ask you some questions tonight. There is no one. You can return to the... Sorry, I didn't see the lights. We first have a question from Councillor Addis.
Thanks, Chair. Do you think you could give us some idea of, I mean, you're, excuse me, implying there's been enormous change, and yet you haven't given us any indication to help us understand?
Sure.
that?
The building was originally an exposed brick building, whilst GML says only a third of the building has been rendered. All of the walls that present to the street have been rendered. It was originally an open undercroft, and that's been infilled so that there's a roller door and panelling. Again, it can be removed. There's nothing to say that, in a sense, you couldn't restore the building, but the question is, under the planning scheme, we have no compulsion to have people do this. So we can encourage, which in my terminology means to exhort people to make positive change, but really we can only extort people in terms of requiring change by making it difficult for them to do other things. So when they want to renovate, we can say, well, you can do that, but we need you to do these extra works. It's a problematic exercise. There's a fence built around half the property to enclose a pool. There is some volcanic rock and early landscaping, but the level of the significance on a comparative basis and how that's to be picked up is a little bit confused. The windows are certainly timber. Their condition is not good, but that's not the issue. It's a question of integrity, and certainly the glass has all got reflective coating film on it. And again, that's very reversible. Glass can be changed. But the real question is this a building that is likely in any foreseeable future to be restored to a position where we look at it and go, that takes me back to the 60s? And I don't think that it's likely, in my view.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Addis. Councillor Watson.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Briggs. I guess my question, trying to phrase it differently because it's fairly similar to Councillor Addis, and you talked about a threshold of integrity, and so I think you partially answered the question, but I'll ask it anyways. So why do you think one caravan street passes the threshold of integrity so that you would say that it's not worthy of being heritage listed?
Essentially, it's an individual building, so it's not supported by a group or row or wider streetscape that amplifies its value. So the notion is that people will hopefully both appreciate it in terms of living in the area, but actually be destinational enough so that you might go there to look at a building from the period. It's painted grey, which is very fashionable for the last 10 years or so, or 5 years, say. It's rendered in an acrylic render, which is, again, very much of a modern, fundamentally rendering will change the fundamental character of a building, perhaps excessively in terms of, or perhaps more than many other changes you might make. So as a building, certainly the general form is recognisable, to me at least, but it's not so different from a whole raft of houses that have been built since and are also rendered. And for the general public, I'm not at all sure that it conveys, in fact, I feel quite strongly that it doesn't convey the clarity of purpose in what is an authenticity material which was important to that period. There's the mid-century modern is particularly important because of its pared-back, crafted construction. I mean, one spin-off is the Brutalist, which is all about the materiality, but the cantilevered rooms, the structure, the form, that immediacy of materiality is so much a part of what I will call a domestic warmth that's important to making this modern period important for the population. So.
Thank you. A follow-up question, if I may, Chair. So you're a heritage consultant, and so I'm curious about the comments you made where you said this is an individual building. Do you think that individual buildings are essentially not supported anymore by the surrounding neighbourhood are now not worthy of heritage protection?
No, I don't at all. But, you know, if you go down Hopetoun Grove, for instance, there's a whole raft of really fine heritage homes that are not protected because they're of a slightly older period than this one. I better not name names or numbers, but, you know, there's a group of buildings that the general public would say that's a fine heritage home, and a good portion of that public will bemoan the demolition of those houses. I accept that they probably don't reach the threshold of individual significance in that we have lots of them, which we don't have so many of the mid-century modern. But the fundamental is that it needs to achieve a threshold of not a planning term, but my term for the last 15 years or so, is destinational. An individual property needs to stand on its own, warrant the overlay. It's not part of a wider, it's a soloist, not a chorus. And it really needs to be something that people will stop and take note of. And in my experience, I struggle to see how I would be sure that that's in fact the experience the public will have of this building, except I appreciate the interest in it. But that's what I call a boffin or a purist interest rather than something that's tested with the general public.
Thank
Thank you very much. And quoting the Wade House case took me back to planning days. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Briggs, for coming in and speaking to us tonight. Just for the sake of clarity, now apart from one Caravan Street, which you've referred to exclusively tonight, and I appreciate that that's the one you are focused on, do you in principle recognise that the resolution before us is to send the matter to planning panel?
Absolutely. What I'm saying is that is itself an expensive,
exercise,
onerous issue. I mean, it is my view, apropos...
Sorry, could you just speak?
It is my view, apropos an earlier comment, that generally for individual properties, I've yet to see a property in my 30 years of experience where I would say heritage protection has increased the value of an individual property. There's no actual upside for the owner except for the kudos of saying I've got a beautiful house. For group controls, that certainly is because you protect a neighbourhood and protect the value of a street and all sorts of things. But for an individual house, it all puts it back on the owner. So now that's not something that we should be considering in theory in making assessments of significance. I appreciate that we put a blinders on and we don't say that, but it's a reality. And the question therefore isn't so much, and I've been misquoted on this in panels on numerous occasions, I won't name panel members particularly, but the issue is that we should be able to exercise the rigour to be quite clear about what's important about the property from the practice note. And where we have this sort of, and it is this question of, it's an onerous process, I cost money and I will charge it, but there's a question of can we in fact hot tub or get to the point of agreeing the differences, agreeing what we agree upon, and get this out of the way now rather than thrashing it out in panels. And I think that's a process that's worth spending time on.
Thank you, Chair. I do note that you're referring to one specific property, not the whole list. Thank you. That's
Absolutely.
clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. I have a clarifier as well, Mr Briggs. You mentioned earlier that the Maroondah Council had established that properties of this period did not have any, no longer had any significance. Did I understand that correct? Or?
No, not at all. Again, they're going through the process, and I am not saying that properties from this period have no value at all, but there was a particular case in relation to a group of homes, project homes built by the Contemporary Home Service with very distant links to Boyd, but overstated by built heritage, but that's been resolved. But the houses may or may not go in as a group, but the point was that they found very clearly, supported by evidence from built heritage and then from Jim Gardner from JGM, that because a number of these houses had been rendered and therefore their character had been fundamentally altered, that they were no longer significant. And on that basis, if we were to, panels don't set precedent, but if we were to take that as a meaningful precedent for this one, we'd be going, well, same boat. Geese and ganders, we really have to just accept that it's so changed, people can't generally enjoy it in the way they should.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bigger, your light isn't on, but from your hand movements, I thought you'd like it to be.
No, I was just going to remind the speaker that it's really helpful, particularly for people in the gallery, I think. Maybe it's my old ears, but it's very helpful if you speak right in, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much. There are no more questions from the councillors. If you can, Mr Bigger, you can return to your seat. Mr Biggs, sorry. I'll call on next Vasilios Barakaya. If I pronounce that wrongly, you have my deepest apologies.
Vasilios Barakia,
Thank you.
Bourne North. I'm just discussing 24 Orion Street, which is part of the list. There are a couple of items that I'd like to raise. Again, people before me have talked about the cost of the upkeep to maintain the houses under heritage, as well as the loss of kind of property value. But I'd like to talk about the actual house itself. There are some fundamental problems with the property itself that I'd like to bring up to everyone's view. One being that the house itself is a butterflied roof, and that particular property itself has some type of fundamental problems. Now, it leaks, has leaked since the purchase of the property, and that's one of the items that kind of degrades the kind of the materials and so forth, and then the upkeep to restore that will be costly, as well as the west-facing property has large panels of glass. Now, that is a seasonal thing. So in winter, it's very, very cold, and in summer, it's very, very hot. Sustainability becomes a bit of an issue that we like to raise, that we can't upkeep the property without doing some fundamental changes with it to bring it to current standards or what will be the future standards as well. The degradation of the materials itself, so there has been some patchwork being done on it. There are fundamental appearances that need to be looked at, as well as kind of, again, maintaining that further down the track. We do have a mismatch of materials, some later periods, and some when the house was built, as well as the extension that we have at the back, which is completely different to the rest of the property. That's basically it on my side.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Try to keep it short.
Councillor Watson, you have a question.
Yes, sorry, I missed what property address you were talking about.
24 Orion Street in Bulwer North.
Thank you.
Councillors, are there any other questions of this presenter tonight? Thank you very much for your presentation. Finally tonight, if I could call Christina Brannigan to join us at the table. Thank you.
Good evening. Should I just start?
Well, with your name, and even though we know you, with your name and your suburb would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yep. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Christina Brannigan. I live in Camberwell. I'm speaking in support of the work and the recommendation tonight. Whilst I do empathise with the owners and their representatives spoken tonight, I don't want to detract from what they've said. I do think that a planning panel is going to be the place to consider most of the issues that have been raised, and one would be hoping that they'll be able to resolve most of these issues. And I do believe that in the future, in the long term, the community is going to be grateful that Council protects some mid-century homes in Balwyn and Balwyn North. We have already lost many of them, and this seems to be our last chance, perhaps. We nearly lost the Boyd House a few years ago, and perhaps that was a lesson learned to ignore the experts at the time. Things come back to bite you on the bum, excuse my French. But I do think in my own experience that heritage places over time do become more and more desirable and valuable. I've lived in a heritage place that was protected about 20 years ago, and whilst I accept that it's perhaps easier in a precinct for that to happen, I do think that we're going to see in the next 20 years or so and more a huge and dramatic change in the sort of housescape of Melbourne, and I do think more and more that these mid-century and modernist homes are going to become more and more desirable and valuable. Perhaps not if we're wanting to sell them in the next 1 or 2 years, but I think in the longer term they absolutely will. And it is Council's role by law to seek heritage places and protect them when they find them. So I do hope that we'll proceed and that a panelling panel will help council to decide what to do for the best, what's fair and reasonable, and look at the evidence. I think that one thing to bear in mind is that everywhere around the world, any place that's been protected that we all go and many of us go and visit around the world, wonderful architecture, all those places were owned by somebody once before it was protected. So if we don't protect places that are owned by someone, nothing is ever going to get protected. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Brannigan. I'll just check with my colleagues. Any questions tonight? No, thank you very much. You can return to the gallery. I'll now return to the officers for matters arising.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Most of the matters that were raised in the verbal presentations have already been addressed, either in the body of the report or in the detailed submissions in the table of the report. Those include the points around the personal financial impacts and the cost of maintenance of places that are in the heritage overlay. There was a comment around council's role better suited to preventing new development that's out of character. That's a separate planning issue that's not related to the heritage overlay and the consideration that we have tonight. I just wanted to touch upon some of the points made by Mr. Briggs, and most of those matters have actually been discussed quite in detail in the summary table against submission number 12, and you could say that that's a matter of a different professional opinion around the impact that the render might have had on the integrity of the building, and there might be precedent of another panel having considered that on those places or in those instances that the rendering has detrimentally impacted the intactness and significance of the place to a point where it's only of interest and not worthy of protection anymore. That doesn't mean that that's the case here or is going to be the case here. Those are professional opinions that need to be sorted out through the panel process, and that's the process for that to happen and the forum for that to happen. To delay the amendment now to negotiate with one property owner when those matters have already been addressed through the report and our consultant has already reviewed those and considered those, it doesn't serve a purpose. That's what the panel hearing process is there for. And whether Mr. Briggs's time is spent on negotiating with our heritage consultant now, or whether those matters are addressed at the panel hearing process, there's not really any substantial difference, and it's not really appropriate to delay for this one property. And I think that's all that I wanted to respond to. Thank you very much. Happy to take any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Any other comments from the officers? No, that's fine. Councillors, have you any? We do. Terrific. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. I have just a couple of questions. One being to clarify the address of number 1 Caravan Street. Is it 1 to 3 Caravan Street, or is it just 1 Caravan Street? Are we talking 2 titles or 1? I was just trying to look it up on MapShare to see whether they've got it listed as 1 or 2 titles, but if you Google the property and go into realestate.com, it clearly says it's 1 to 3 Caravan Street. And I think this issue came up in the last time this property came before council. Yeah, on MapShare it's got it as 1 to 3 as well, but no.
We're just checking that in Weave at the moment.
It's not 2 titles, it's just 1.
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
It seems to be that it shows up as 1 to 3 and as 1 title, but I don't have a copy of the title in front of me, so I wouldn't be able to confirm that with definitely. It's certainly something that, if a correction is required through the panel hearing process and eventual adoption of the amendment that could be fixed if it's required.
Thank you. I have another question as well, arising from one of the reports one of the presentations we heard tonight, and this one's from Mr. Briggs. He talked about some of the alterations that have been made to the property, and I'm no builder, so this might be a complete numpty question, but acrylic render, does that change the character of the building, and is that reversible? Because I seem to be hearing that an acrylic render wasn't, so I just thought I'd ask.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I'm no expert in renders and how to remove it. I don't know whether the fact that it is acrylic makes a difference. Certainly where Mr. Briggs's opinion differs from Council's Heritage Consultant is that Council's Heritage Consultant doesn't think that the render has impacted the significance of the place and the attractiveness of the place to a point where it would justify not proceeding with the heritage overlay for this site.
Thank you very much. And Chair, I'm prepared to move the motion at the appropriate time.
Thank you. Councillor Stavro, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Look, the question I have, I think I may know the answer, but not 100% sure. It goes to some of the fears expressed by the presenters, particularly when it comes to repairs, and also I think one of the later presenters about the thermal qualities of a building if required to change them. My question is whether, if it's too costly to make a repair and it's needed, or the thermal qualities need to change, and I know the next step would be the panel, but let's say that heritage is granted overlay. Is there something protecting the residents so that they're not up for exorbitant costs when something like a thermal need is I would say, an imperative?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So I think it's important to understand what the heritage overlay does. It sets a planning permit trigger for external changes to the building. So we're not proposing any internal controls as part of this. So if there's a replacement for maintenance of like for like, then that doesn't actually trigger the need for a planning permit, then the heritage overlay doesn't actually have an impact in that regard. Where changes are needed, and that may be glazing, potentially because of thermal efficiencies, that's something that our planning department will have to consider then on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the change that is proposed to improve the thermal efficiency of the building is actually going to have a detrimental impact on the significance of the place. And the answer to that may be yes, in which case an alternative solution might have to be found, or the answer may be no, it doesn't actually have an impact, and you get a planning permit for those changes, and that might still achieve the environmental outcome that's required or not. No, I'm no heritage expert that is familiar with those matters, and that's what the planning permit process is there for, to sort out.
May I ask a follow-up then? I think that's very clear, but in the event of where you need to change, let's say, for thermal purposes, and it is the difference between one cost and another cost is so exorbitant, that's the bit that I want to sort of get a little bit of clarification.
Thank you, through you, Chair. From memory, the heritage policy that the planners would use to assess an application does not allow for consideration of the cost impact of proposed works compared to an alternative. So that's generally not something that would be considered in the planning permit process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wilmsman, just wanted to ask, the first presenter, Jim Lotus, mentioned the Boyd home in Balwyn not being protected. My understanding is the Boyd home in Tanook Street in Balwyn North has heritage overlay, is that correct? I believe in 2021, I think.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I don't think there's only one Boyd house in Balwyn, so I'm not entirely sure which property is being referred to. If it's Tanock Street, then that's included in the heritage overlay, and there are other Boyd houses in Balwyn. If there's a particular one, then that's not protected. We'd like to know about it.
Yeah, Thank you. It was my understanding. And a final question, and you may not be able to answer this, but just if council support the officer's recommendation and the homes go to a panel, do you know approximately ETA of how long it would take for a panel hearing to convene?
It's usually within 4 to 6 weeks of council requesting the panel. I'm not sure what this has been scheduled for, I have to admit. It's usually written in the explanatory report as part of the exhibition, roughly when the hearing has been preset for.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. This might be something that's a bit hard to give an answer to, but I'm trying to get a sense of alteration and the extent to which certain changes inevitably occur over time, and whether or how does one assess when a threshold has been crossed that a building no longer has significant value? I'm assuming you're going to tell me there's no definitive answer, but...
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Yes, there's no definitive answer. I mean, ultimately, as we can see tonight, and the different opinion expressed by Mr. Briggs compared to what Council's Heritage Consultant, there is always an element of subjectivity in a heritage assessment, and that is tried to be normalised, standardised through a series of tests and questions that a heritage consultant, whether it's Mr. Briggs or whether it's GML or GJM, run through to reach their conclusion. Now, one consultant might come up with a different question, a different answer to one question than another one based on how they view a site or the extent of change that have been made to one. So it's not an exact mathematical science where you type in and a formula spits you out the result. It just doesn't work like that.
Perhaps
and that's what we have the panel process for, to have an independent review. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Can I have a follow-up? Perhaps the question I should have asked is, presumably the heritage consultant who has provided these assessments had some awareness of the changes that have occurred and is still saying, yes, in their belief they're worthy. Is that?
Thank you, through. Yes, absolutely. They're aware of the changes that have been made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. A question, one that may not be easy to answer, but is it reasonable to assume that should a heritage overlay be applied to the properties in question? I'm not referring to any specific property, but let's say a property of individual significance that is of exposed masonry on the facade. Would that guarantee the heritage overlay that an owner would not be able to put some kind of contemporary render over that material if it were, as in many cases with mid-century modernist properties, the exposed masonry is a unique and particular feature of those properties? And the reason I ask whether that protection would apply is my concern with the number one caravan, the discussion about the render and the panel potentially, or the discussion of the consultants saying that it does have heritage value. I presume they see the render as something that is a detriment, but potentially reversible, and rather than something that would be acceptable and still have heritage value. I mean, I understand why they'd say there's heritage value, but surely it does detract a little bit, but not sufficiently to call into question the overall value. Is that reasonable?
Thank you, and through you. I think I know what you're asking. So I think the issue and I'm not the heritage consultant who's undertaken the assessment. I think that I have to preface that because I'm not obviously a heritage expert. The issue here in this particular circumstance with the one caravan is that we're not talking about the entire an entire building built out of brick and all the brick has been rendered. A large proportion of the building, probably about 2/3, are actually glazing. So the brick is only a small component of the design, and would Council's heritage consultant maybe have preferred that the render hadn't been applied? The answer would probably be yes, but in the context of the design of the building, that change to that third of the building is not consequential enough for them to change their recommendation and professional opinion that the site should be protected through the heritage overlay.
Okay, thank you. But it's reasonable to assume that for other properties, that should the heritage overlay be applied and they're of exposed masonry, and that we would have some certainty through the heritage overlay that a render of that nature may not occur. I mean, I appreciate a planning permit application may occur, but we would have some degree of certainty that that kind of degrading would not occur.
Thank you. And through you, yes, a rendering of a previously unfinished surface would require a planning permit. And then it's down to the assessment and the statement of significance that's written, and if that's identified as an important element of the design of the building, then that's probably unlikely that there would be support for that through issuing of a planning permit.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, councillors. There appears to be no further questions of the officers tonight. We now move to a motion. Councillor Watson, you indicated you were prepared to move a motion.
Yes, I am, as printed on the screen, Chair.
When you're ready, I'll be seeking a seconder to this motion.
Happy to second, Chair.
Councillor Sinfield, you're prepared to second on what you've read? Terrific. Is anyone opposed to this motion? No opposition. Terrific. Councillor Watson, would you like to speak to your motion now?
Yes, I will briefly. I think that this discussion needs to continue in another place where the experts are. I'm certainly no expert, and I've really appreciated the presentations that have been made to us by our community tonight to make us think carefully about this decision. Appreciate all the questions and inquiry that have happened around this table from my colleagues, and I commend this motion to the vote, and thank everyone for their participation tonight.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sinfield, this is your time.
Thank you, Chair, but I don't think the motion is opposed, so I'll refrain.
Thank you very much indeed. Nothing further to add, Councillor Watson. Thank you. I shall now put this motion to the vote. All of those in favour? No one against? The motion, I declare the motion carried. Thank you. We will now move on to item 3.2 in the agenda, Mount Iris Estate and Environs Heritage Review, consideration of the panel report amendment C394. I understand tonight we have one person in the gallery wishing to speak. When I call your name, which will be very shortly. Oh, sorry. Caught again. I might let you speak first, Mr. Williamson, so we have something to talk about. My apologies. Could you please present your report now?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The purpose of this report is to inform the Urban Planning Delegated Committee of the outcomes of the independent planning panel process appointed to consider the Amendment C394 and related submissions. The hearing was held on the 11th of December, with 2 opposing submitters participating in the hearing process. The panel report was received just before Christmas on the 21st of December and was released to the public on the 9th of January. The panel generally supports the amendment, subject to a number of changes. Most of those changes had already been supported by the UPDC following the exhibition process, and these include a mapping correction to include 33 Tower Hill Road, Ashburton in the Tower Hill Estate Precinct, deleting the reference to garage for the property 44 Den Street in the precinct grading schedule of the statement of significance for that precinct, and then deleting the reference to fence and garage for 10 Munro Avenue. Those 2 changes with regards to 44 and 10 Munro mean that those elements are not identified as contributory to the significance of that place and the precinct. In addition to those changes that have previously been endorsed by the UPDC, the panel has also recommended some changes to the wording in a column of the Heritage Overlay Schedule to clarify the operation of the exemption from notice and review. And I'm happy to take detailed questions on that because it's quite a technical matter. Officers recommend the UPDC resolve to receive and accept the panel's recommendations and refer the matter to an ordinary meeting of council for final adoption of the amendment as recommended by the panel. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Now that we've had the great value of your report, I might return to the gallery. Mr. Greg Price, would you like to join us at the table? Mr. Price, I'd just like to remind you again, we have a limit of 3 minutes on speaking, which you know very well. And if you could again start with your name and the suburb in which you live, it would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good evening, councillors. My name is Greg Price from Glen Iris. I have 2 requests essentially. Remove the Den Street precinct from the proposal, or delay the implementation to let me finish my property, which is primarily landscaping and fencing at this stage. So according to policies, heritage protection is for community as such. Precincts of contributory or non-contributory properties should be able to be readily identified and appreciated as such by the broad community, not just paid heritage experts. In the first panel report, Den Street was not identified as a potential precinct, yet other areas of Mont Iris was. The May 2022 UPDC meeting resolved that an assessment should be done primarily to focus on the northern and northeastern and eastern parts of the estate. Previously, the consultants doggedly resisted changes and discrepancies in the previous precinct definition, yet it was found to be incorrect and was eventually abandoned. Nothing new has been uncovered in relation to justifying the proposed Den Street precinct in this peer review. The Den Street precinct isn't contiguous and has a gap in the middle and is only on one side of the street. The 2 sections can't see each other due to a bend in the road, and in addition there's an increase in elevation in the gap. Hence, it's difficult to appreciate as a precinct. This gap actually skews the numbers based on the number of contributory properties in the included. So that gap in the middle of the properties aren't included as non-contributory, although mine is, which is newer. The precinct is not coherent or consistent and contains many alterations. There's a mixture of timber, brick and rendered facades. Some of the windows have been replaced with modern styles. Only 16 of the 23 properties still have the original low brick fences. And even the latest panel report said, the panel observed that at least one, in brackets generally several, of the features of English domestic revival style in almost every contributory property in each precinct. One feature of a style in a property, particularly when there are different styles, is hardly a threshold that reaches the level of, quote, significance which defines heritage, particularly in comparison to other precincts. The style is claimed to be English domestic revival, yet there's no half timbering, there's no steeply pitched roofs, except for a property that isn't included in the proposed overlay, or tall, narrow grouped windows. The association with the style is basically loose at best. There's missing information which is required by Practice Note 01 from the Statement of Significance, and the The experts didn't notice the difference between an original garage and something that was only built 13 years ago. The fence at number 44 is almost completely new metal fence, and the panel report actually refers to Glen Ira a number of times rather than Glen Iris. Number 16 was built in 1934. So the...
Thank you, Mr. Price. I'd like you to wrap up fairly quickly.
Wrap it up there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Councillors, Councillor Franco, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd like if Mr. Price could perhaps articulate or be given the opportunity to articulate precisely what he's seeking from the UPDC. His property is one that we've dealt with on a number of occasions here in this chamber over the years, and it's always been one that's been complex, but it'd be good to understand precisely what you're requesting.
So I'm requesting removing the Dent Street precinct from the proposal, so the rest of the Mont Iris and the significant properties that have been identified and the rest of it stands. So it's just purely the Dent Street precinct as two groups of houses on one side of the street, so remove that from remove the Dent Street precinct solely.
Okay. Thank you. You finished, Councillor Franco? Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Price, that completes. There's no more. It doesn't appear to be any further questions. You can return to the gallery. I'd like to return now to the officers to comment on matters arising.
Thank you, and through your chair. Not too much to respond to you. The matters have already been well responded to and considered by the independent panel, and the panel has formed the view that the Dent Street precinct is justified through the heritage citation and the assessment, and officers don't see a view to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? No. Oh, popped up. We do. Councillor Watson.
No question, but happy to move the motion at the appropriate time, unless my colleague, Councillor Franco, would like to move the motion, then I'm happy to second.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to move the motion. Thank you. A motion. I did want to ask the officers a couple of questions first. And I'm just trying to find the location. One, it's a topic that came up previously, 20 Munro, which is on page 78 of the PDF, and there was reference to the fence and the garage being considered significant contributory, and specifically the garage. The garage is identified as being potentially too small for modern living needs. And I'd just like to understand from the officers, if we were to proceed, not simply down this path, but all the way to an eventual overlay, which did include the garage, how would the issue of creating a garage that is functional for modern day living and a vehicle beyond a motorcycle, say, even though I'm a motorcycle rider and very supportive of facilities, I don't think they're adequate for contemporary living. How could that be addressed? Because I'm concerned that we would simply lock in a garage that might not be functional at the front of the property as well.
Officers.
Thank you, and through your chair. I don't know that I have a proper answer other than to say that that's a matter that would have to be considered in detail. And if someone felt that changes were needed to the garage so that their car can fit through the opening and it would require opening, then that's something for the heritage consultant to consider at that point in time, whether an opening, increasing the opening, for example, whether that would have such an impact on the significance that that's not supported. But beyond that, I think I wouldn't be able to give you any definitive answer on how such an application might be viewed if it were to be lodged.
Thank you. Councillor Watson, your light's still on. Do you want to engage in questions further? Thank you. Councillor Stavro.
Look, I'm acting as a spell checker, Chair. The fourth bullet point, Anne has creeped in just before the meeting, so.
Are you allowed that role tonight?
Not sure. At your mercy, Chair.
Councillor Park's not present.
You happy if we move forward, taking that as a note? Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, Councillor Franco, your light's still on.
That's correct, Chair.
You wish to ask further questions? Right, thank you.
I'd like to move a motion.
Thank you. I was just about to give you the opportunity to do that, but thank you for jumping in. If you'd move your motion at this point in time, that'd be great.
I'd like to move the officer's recommendation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Watson.
Happy to second the motion.
Is anyone opposed to that motion tonight? It is unopposed. Thank you. But, Councillor Franco, you still have the right to speak to it. We look forward to your addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was expecting you to say I didn't have the right to speak. I'll keep it very short. This has been quite a few years in the making, and there have been many changes to the overlay and the proposed overlay. I think it's a routine step going forward, but it's supported, I believe, unanimously, as we'll see. So I won't go on. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Watson, your light isn't on. I presume you don't want to speak to it?
No, thank you, Chair.
Thank
Happy
you.
for the motion to be put.
Marvellous. I now put this motion to the vote. All in favour? No one against? Thank you. I declare this motion carried. Okay, we'll move on to item 3.3 on the agenda tonight. 12 Hawthorne Grove, Hawthorne, dwelling extension in a heritage overlay, PP 23/0325. We will have our officers' reports first on this occasion. Ms. Kelly Caparasso, maybe you'd like to repronounce that for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I present UPDC item 3.3 relating to planning permit application PP 23/0325, 12 Hawthorne Grove, Hawthorne. Next slide. It is proposed to extend the existing dwelling at 12 Hawthorne Grove, Hawthorne. This will include the demolition of non-contributory additions and a 2-storey addition over a basement rumpus room. The subject site is located within the Neighbourhood Residential Zone Schedule 3 and no permit is required under the zone. The subject site is covered by Heritage Overlay HO 152 and the original dwelling is graded as being significant within the Grace Park and Hawthorne Grove Heritage Precinct. The subject site is occupied by a late Victorian Federation red brick dwelling with a slate tiled roof. The original dwelling was constructed in 1899. The dwelling is set back behind an established front garden with a low timber picket fence. Vehicle access to the dwelling is provided by a single crossover from Hawthorne Grove, which extends along the site's western boundary. The application was advertised in October 2023 and 13 objections were received. The key matters in respect to this application is the demolition, the building height, setbacks, design details and materials. The proposal is considered to be acceptable for the following reasons. The extent of demolition is appropriate and retains all parts of the building worthy of heritage protection. The proposed extension is set back approximately 30 metres from the street and is entirely behind the original dwelling's principal roof form. Permit conditions can be included to ensure the dwelling interfaces appropriately with the heritage building so that it is clearly distinguishable from the site's heritage fabric. The height of the proposed extension complies with Council's heritage policy sightline diagrams and will have an acceptable level of visibility from the oblique views. Council's heritage advisor supports the proposal subject to conditions. These conditions have been included within the officer recommendation. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the officer recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caparaso. And I'd like to point out the new presentation format we've got, fairly cartoonic and diagrammatic, and I'm sure that helps everyone in the chamber. Thank you. We will now move to public submissions. Three in the gallery tonight have asked to make submissions, 2 against and 1 in support.
Liebler, and I'm here for one of my clients who is a resident of a nearby property to this site. So, councillors, you've heard this evening 2 items where people have come to you talking about proposed heritage overlays. Well, here we're talking about an application in a heritage overlay. And what we'd say about that is that, you know, you've heard today from other submitters and members of the community that heritage overlays are really a very valued part of what makes Boroondara the place that it is. And it's why many residents, like my client, choose to live within the municipality. Heritage is a shared asset. Landowners like my client and indeed the permit applicant are custodians for future generations and indeed the broader community. And the council has its role to play in the administration of the Boroondara planning scheme, ensuring that the decisions that this council makes align with the purpose and decision guidelines of that heritage overlay, and to ensure that heritage assets are conserved for future generations and not at the expense of heritage significance to the broader place. Now, what we're talking about here is a precinct overlay, but it is a property that's got the highest level of grading within that precinct. The permit applicant's own heritage advisor acknowledges that you know, it's a fairly old property in terms of the history of that precinct. And there are a number of other important, significant and contributory buildings proximate to this site. Council's heritage policy seeks to encourage development which is sympathetic and subservient to the heritage fabric. Now, what we'd say about what's proposed here does the complete opposite. Particularly views from the public realm are of utmost importance, but Council's heritage policy also acknowledges laneway views. And what this proposal does is propose a very large, bulky architectural response. And we're not here to critique the architectural credentials of the proposal, but what is proposed here is a very bold form and significant for a heritage place. We say that the material that's been submitted in support of this application, in terms of the 3D imagery, we say is a little bit misleading in terms of what you might see. They look to be sort of rudimentary box-like renders as opposed to photorealistic renders that we might expect. The last thing I'd say is that the topography of this particular pocket of the precinct, it slopes down towards Kincora Road, and we're concerned about the extent of built form and how this might be viewed in the broader precinct, and we say that the council's approval tonight sets a dangerous precedent for future development within this particular heritage overlay. So tonight I ask this committee to move forward with a recommendation to refuse the grant of the permit. And
Thank you, Ms. East. I'll get you to wrap up now if you wouldn't mind. Thank you very much indeed. Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter? There are none. Thank you very much. You may return to the gallery. I now call upon Mr. Ian Abbott.
Thank you. Before I start, could I ask that on the screen you get page 11 of the officer's report showing? Can you scroll down?
Mr. Abbott, can I get you to start with your name, even though I've announced it, and the
Yeah,
suburb
sure.
in which you
I'm
live?
Ian Abbott from Hawthorn.
Thank you. Okay, you ready to go?
Can I get page 11 of the report up? Sorry. Okay.
Sidelines. The sideline diagram.
Oh, okay.
It's the sideline diagram. Yeah, we just passed it. That's it, I think. Yeah, he's got it. I think we now
Thank you.
have it. Are you
Yes.
ready to go?
Great. All right, thank you. I've been delegated to speak on behalf of 12 of the 13 objectors. Thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. I want to talk about three things. Firstly, the height of the proposed addition, and I think council is in a very strong position to reject this application because the application has a material and fundamental defect. The sightline drawing above shows Hawthorn Grove to have a large slope from one side to the other. This flat nature whereas in fact the slope is negligible, this flat nature of the street is clear to the naked eye, but to be sure I had it confirmed this morning by a qualified surveyor. It is not for me to speculate as to how or why the sightline diagram above is so misleading, but it makes a huge difference to any assessment of this application. From the reports of both the Heritage Advisor and the Council Officer, including the verbal presentation tonight, it was clear that in assessing whether the height detracted from or dominated the heritage place, they gained a lot of comfort from the sight lines and from the notation on the plans above that the extension clears the sight line from the street. This is a false statement in relation to the most fundamental point, and this puts the council in a very strong position because if this matter were to be appealed to VCAT, it would likely be summarily dismissed on the basis of the application being defective. I could probably stop there because it seems so fundamental, but I'll go on and briefly do the second and third points. The second one is on setbacks. The Heritage Advisor states that the side setbacks are similar to the existing. This is factually incorrect and very difficult to see how they drew this conclusion. The current side setback is 1 metre in from the significant place. It is visually recessive, which is the language in the guidelines of council, whereas the new ground floor addition is actually on the boundary, 3.2 metres out from the building. It's not recessive. The second story setback also sits out 70 centimetres from the current building and is not visually regressive as consistent with council guidelines. It's hard to see how the similarity comment was made. The third point is on massing. The guidelines talk to the addition not dominating the significant place. The significant place is 20 metres long and has a roof line that is 6 metres high. The second story of the proposed new addition is 22 metres long and has a roof that is 7.4 metres high. The Heritage Advisor merely notes that the proposed addition is sited to the rear, full stop. It makes no comments as to its relative dimensions,
Mr Abbott, I would get you to wrap up now if you wouldn't mind. Thanks very much.
Council can make a big difference to the amenity of the area. VCAT practicalities can make this difficult at times, but here tonight, Council is assessing a fundamentally defective application.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter? Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Abbott, for presenting to us, and you've certainly raised some very interesting points.
Metre lower, and given that the sightline drawing is not quite a metre out, but nearly a metre out, the person standing on the other side of the street is drawn to be standing nearly a metre lower than even though the street is broadly flat, and the surveyor confirmed that to me this morning. I have it in writing. Whereas if that person is a metre higher level, then the building is visible. So if I'm saying if they're a metre higher, if the height of the building comes down a metre, then that would be very acceptable. The second point is around the visually recessive nature of buildings. This is a significant building. You can see there that it is not recessive. And so on the top, it's actually jutting out quite a lot. If the line of the original house is 3.2 metres in from the fence, the new building is 2.5 metres in from the fence, so it's 70 centimetres closer. It could easily, this is a 23 metre wide block, it could easily be consistent with the current addition, which is in another 70 centimetres. So, not a huge, you've got 23 metres to work with, just a little bit in. The last point is that that diagram is quite misleading because the building at the back is actually longer than the building at the front, and therefore it would dominate and overbear. Particularly, the other thing that's misleading is it doesn't show, you should be able to see that, you should be able to see the whole of that building across the top if the sight lines were drawn correctly. So I would be happy with it a metre in, a metre down, and 10 metres along from the current house. In terms of, 10 metres, the second story to extend no more than 10 metres from the significant place.
Councillor Gillies, do you have any further questions?
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr
Nobody else has got any questions. Thank you, Mr Abbott. If you just return to the gallery, it'd be appreciated. Thank you. I now call upon Carolyn Baker to join us at the table.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Carolyn Baker and I'm the Director of Heritage at Urbis and I'm based in Melbourne. I am...
Gone off.
I'm here to speak in support of the current application for 12 Hawthorn Grove in Hawthorn. It's a building that was constructed in 1899 and it anticipates the Federation era and the Queen Anne revival. It's located in the Hawthorn Grove and Grace Park Heritage Overlay Precinct, and that's a very important precinct in Melbourne. So there's no contesting the fact that this is an important building. It's identified as being significant. In terms of demolition, Burundara's heritage policy asks for all significant fabric in a place to be retained as part of any proposed scheme, and the proposed scheme does that. There are MMBW maps that show exactly how much was there in 1901, and the only parts that are really being altered are those that were very heavily altered in the 1970s. In terms of the alterations and additions, the City of Burundara's heritage policy, it doesn't ask for concealment. It asks for double-storey additions to not detract from or otherwise adversely affect the heritage place. And it asks for additions to do that in terms of siting and massing. Now, the proposed double-storey addition is set back very, very deep within the site. It's over 31 metres within the site. And this needs to be put in the context of a streetscape where both of the adjoining dwellings are double-storey. You don't need to look past the streetscape elevation that's been produced as part of this application documentation to see that the double-storey addition actually sits well below the double-storey dwellings to either side. And on top of that, it's constructed over 30 metres deep within the site. It very much complies with, what we would typically sort of describe as being visually recessive. On top of that, there are very sort of narrow view corridors sort of to that deep within the site. So any visibility is really limited to a small section of Hawthorn Grove. In terms of the laneway to the rear, there are sometimes heritage laneways, but this isn't one. It's really characterised by roller doors and vehicular access to the places on either side. In terms of the fall of the site, I've been informed that it's actually a surveyor that's sort of helped provide the information on which the buildings are produced. And my photos show that the building does slope down towards Hawthorn Grove as well. There are 3 brick courses between the front of the western elevation and the rear, before there's a sort of rock-faced basalt plinth at the front. And in my opinion, the proposed scheme complies with the provisions of clause 15.03, which is Council's heritage policy.
Ms Baker, I'll get you to wrap up now, if you wouldn't mind.
And 43.01. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillors, questions. Councillor Gillies, your light is on.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Baker, for your presentation. Very informative. I just wanted to check in with you. You heard that one of the objectors to this motion raised the idea, and I believe there might have been some conversations, but I don't know, around some relatively minor reductions in the bulk. How do you think your client might be amenable to that sort of discussion?
I think it's, without discussing it with them, I wouldn't know, but I think it's completely unnecessary. And I think the streetscape elevation in the application drawings illustrates the extent to which that's the case. For instance, the adjoining dwelling at number 10 Hawthorn Grove, I think it is actually, it's a double-storey Victorian dwelling, and its front facade is located closer to Hawthorn Grove than the subject dwelling, and then the double-storey addition to 12 Hawthorn Grove is proposed to be over 30 metres back. I really don't think it's necessary.
A minor follow-up question, if I may, thanks, Chair. And I believe there's been a conversation around potentially limiting the colour that can be used in the extension on the reducing the material schedule to replace white render, perhaps with a colour that relates to the front of the building. My understanding is that conversation has been had, so if we were to include that as another condition, you see that as acceptable?
I think, yes, I believe that is an acceptable condition, and I think the intention was for it to have quite a lot of warmth anyway and not be a sort of hard, cold white. So,
good. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Since there's no more lights on, we might now return to the officers for matters arising. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Firstly, in relation to the sightline diagrams, there was contention over the levels of that. The sightline diagrams that have been provided do show spot levels. We assume that those spot levels are correct. However, even if the spot levels are not correct and there is a completely straight edge to the edge of the street, those sightline diagrams still comply. This is quite a wide street. The street has a width of 30 metres from the start of the building to the edge of the street where the sightline diagram's to be taken from. And that, in combined with a very large site of over 1,300 square metres, means that those sightline diagrams actually quite easily comply whether or not there's a slope that's been indicated on the sightline diagrams or not. So we take the application on the spot, on the face value that those spot diagrams are correct. Even if they were not to be correct, the sightline diagrams would still comply with the level of visibility anticipated by Council's heritage policy. In terms of the concerns relating to the laneway character is rear access. It's characterised by garage doors on the boundary and outbuildings on the boundary. The streetscape that is to be protected within this heritage policy is clearly Hawthorn Grove, and that's the streetscape that will take most precedence. Council's heritage policy actually preferences vehicle access from the laneway rather than Kincora Road. In terms of the massing and visibility, the proposed development is entirely behind the original dwelling and principal roof form. Again, the large site area means that there can be that visibility, even though it may be visible from the oblique views, is very recessive behind the principal roof form. Council's heritage policy doesn't require new development to be invisible, but it does require it to be recessive and set back, which this development is. I think that's most of the matters arising. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms Caparasso. Councillors, are there any questions? There don't appear to be any lights on. Oh, Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Not a light, but to propose a motion when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the motion. Councillor Gillies, this is the time for your motion.
Moving right along. Thank you, Chair. In recognition of the fact that this site is within the Glenferrie ward, for which Councillor Galt is the councillor, but as he's acting as chair, I'd like to put forward a motion, please. It's basically the officer's recommendation with a small amendment, which you can see marked in red, referring to the colour matter.
I'm not sure that's where we were. Councillor Gillies, I might just check if the officers have got the right recommendation at this point in time, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Chair. Not quite the one we had.
If you just give us a moment, I think there's a slight adjustment might need to take place.
Chair, while you're doing that, or while officers are doing that, I have a question that won't drag officers into debate, if it might be allowed.
I'll consider it. Go ahead while we're waiting, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, and through you to officers, I'm wondering if the heritage overlay applies external paint controls to this dwelling, and if in fact we are able to make this change as proposed to the motion.
Thank you. While we're waiting, do you wish to answer that, or do we have paint controls, and can we make... Oh, well, let's see what the motion is first, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I'm comfortable with officers addressing the question, if that helps move us forward.
Let's wait till debate, Councillor Gillies, I think. Just let's see what we're addressing first.
Chair, I would like to ask some questions in relation to this proposed change from Councillor Gillies, if that's okay. I'd prefer to have officers be able to comment.
It's specific.
But if you'd prefer that officers don't comment, then we'll just deal with it.
I'm happy to move a motion to suspend standing orders.
Do we have a seconder to that? Councillor Addis, all those in support of that motion? Is there anyone against? We suspend standing orders. Thank you. I guess the questions go back to Councillor Sinfield first.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, in relation to Heritage Overlay 152, which I think is the applicable heritage overlay to this dwelling, I'm just wondering if officers might be able to assist me, as I'm not able to quickly find it online, whether we actually have external paint controls to this dwelling, and if in fact we are able to make this change as proposed here.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, there are no external paint controls on the site. This is a permit condition, and permit conditions can sometimes go outside of what are strict planning controls, and it ties into the original dwelling. It's a muted tone. It seems to be accepted by the applicant. It's low risk.
Could you speak into the microphone? We're struggling to hear.
Sorry. This will be a permit condition that will be tied to the proposed development. There are no external paint controls, but it is something that can be conditioned, and it's low risk. The permit applicant has accepted it, and it's also inconsistent with the heritage advice as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Have you finished your question? Thank you. We might go back to the order. It's on the screen. Councillor Hollingsworth, I let Councillor Sinfield jump in because of earlier indication of having a question. So we'll return to you, Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. I actually left my light on to second the motion, so I'll turn it off for now. Thank you.
All right, that's fine.
Thank you. Can I ask my question? Thank you.
Franco, thank you.
I'd like to understand, I mean, the change, in the red amendment to the original motion, which I take it that's the only change to the officer's recommendation of the words in red, we move from a muted colour or similar to a muted colour to match the gable end and trim of the existing dwelling. Now, I'm wondering whether what colour we're matching and what matching means, and secondly, to what extent would we be undermining the differentiation between the old and new and trying to impose, whether it's I'm going too far in my concern, some colours that go towards creating faux heritage rather than really making a clear demarcation between the contemporary new materials and the heritage in accordance with our heritage policies, in accordance with best practice as well. So I'm wondering whether we're moving away from that by those words, and to what extent we might be.
Officers, would you care to respond to that?
Through you, Chair. In terms of the colour of the gabled edges are currently like a cream beige muted colour, and we're wanting to reflect that muted colour scheme in the extension. So it's not a bright, reflective white. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Perhaps just to answer the second part of the question as well through yourself, Chair, the matching of the colour in itself will make no discernible difference to suggesting that this is a design or approach to the rear extension that mirrors or mimics the heritage of the dwelling. It will still be a clearly distinguishable and separable part of the building.
And to what extent, because when I hear officers talking almost as if they're owning the amended words in red, those amended words in red have been run past the applicant or the applicant's representative, and they're happy with that as well. Is that correct? Or you don't see any real difference between the words in red and the original motion? Is that how you read it?
Through yourself, Chair, there is no significant concern of the difference between the officer recommendation and what is included here. Our understanding is that the applicant does accept this change, and from our perspective, from a heritage point of view, it is not a change of any concern.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Addis.
I'm just questioning whether the mover and the seconder, I think it needs another two in the red text, to a muted colour and match to the gable, or to a muted colour and to match the gable. Either is fine.
Are you happy with that, mover?
Thank you, sorry.
Could we add that?
Somebody has to take
Liam, are you clear what that
Councillor
is?
Park's role when he's not here.
Terrific. Thank you, Councillor Addis. No further questions at this point in time. Can I have a motion to return to, are we happy to return to standing orders?
Yeah, happy to move the motion to reinstate standing orders.
Can we have a seconder for that? We do. Councillor Hollingsworth, I think, got up first on that.
Yes, happy to second, thank you.
All in support of moving back to standing orders? Resume standing orders. I think we're at the point of time where we can actually look at the motion. So the motion is now before us. I'm not too sure we had a seconder yet, so we have a seconder. Councillor Holdingsworth, the seconder.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone opposed to the motion as it appears on the screen now? Unopposed? Thank you. Councillor Gillies, do you wish to speak to this motion?
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, and as I said before, in recognition of the fact that this is in Glenferrie Ward and you are the councillor for that, my understanding is that the slight amendment regarding colour was negotiated between parties to address some minor objections. So thank you, and thank you to the objectors for their patience and willingness to negotiate some of these things, and to the proponent too. I think the main issue that was raised by objectors has been addressed by officers, and that was regarding the height defect, how that would potentially affect a VCAT assessment, and we've been assured that it complies. So on the basis of that, we have no grounds for refusal. So I put this motion to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hollingsworth, even though it's unopposed, do you wish to speak?
Happy to put the motion, thank you.
Fantastic. Let's now put the motion. All of those in favour? Anyone against? The motion is declared as carried. Thank you very much. Ready to go? Okay, we'll now move to the final substantive item for tonight. Item 3.4 on your agenda, 7 Mangara Road, Canterbury. This will be a presentation of a draft SCO incorporated document for Amendment C408. First, we'll start with the officer's report given tonight by Ms. Marie Sherif, Principal Heritage Planner. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers and attendees. At its meeting on the 5th of February, the Urban Planning Delegated Committee considered a report on the disrepair and unlawful demolition of the Heritage House Shenley Croft at 7 Mangara Road, Canterbury. The committee resolved to, amongst other things, request ministerial intervention to apply the specific controls overlay to the land at 7 Mangara Road for the reconstruction of Shenley Croft. In addition, the committee also requested that upon preparation of a control document, a a further report is to be presented to the Urban Planning Delegated Committee or Council. In response to this resolution, this report presents the incorporated document under the proposed Specific Controls Overlay, Schedule 13, or SCO 13, which is attached at Attachment 1. In brief, the incorporated document intends to override any contrary or inconsistent provision in the Burundara planning scheme to prevent demolition, including partial demolition, of the fire-damaged heritage dwelling. It also intends to require reconstruction of the heritage dwelling to its built form and habitable condition prior to 30 November 2020, which was the last sale date of the property. And it intends to require reconstruction of the heritage dwelling within 12 months of the date of gazettal of the incorporated document, or of the SCO, Specific Controls Overlay, and completion within 24 months of commencement of the reconstruction works, or as otherwise agreed to by the responsible authority. The incorporated document has been drafted in accordance with legislative intent and the provisions of Section 6B, Heritage Buildings, of the Planning and Environment Act 1987. Officers also note that a request for ministerial intervention to apply the SCO to the land and to introduce the attached incorporated document in the Burundara planning scheme was lodged on 8th of February. In conclusion, and as proposed in the alternate resolution, which I think we have up. Do we have it up? We don't. Okay. Okay, sorry. My mistake. I don't have the original one now. Do you have the original? No, this one. Sorry, I'll just go back. So we're not putting forth the alternative motion yet. Sorry. Go ahead.
The officer's recommendation is on the screen.
Yeah, sorry. As is there.
Okay, officers, that's your report. Thank you very much indeed. We have in the gallery tonight 5 requests to make submissions. 4 in support of the recommendation, and the other one we're not too sure. We might start at that end of the list. Once I announce your name, as with the previous matters tonight, if you join us at the horseshoe table.
For other other fire-damaged properties or storm-damaged properties for rebuilding them. And essentially, why shouldn't this be part of the planning scheme? You've probably noticed a lot of my submissions that I make are around having certainty for residents and people trying to do things. And it's like whether it's the interest layer and things like that. And my issue with having a specific control overlay is that we're venturing down the path of individual or bespoke solutions to what should be a common problem. Now, I understand, or my latest reading was that the 2 main issues are, one is why is this being pursued as a document and a specific control overlay rather than being part of the planning scheme in general for dealing with heritage listed houses. And the other issue is the reports have talked about the property falling into disrepair. Now, whenever council and panels have gone and discussed heritage overlays, it's always mentioned that they're not expected to be kept to a particular standard and maintained. Yet the reports here, there's all this talk of the properties falling into disrepair. So I guess I'd like some clarification around what are the expectations for people that have properties in heritage overlays. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Price. We have no questions of you tonight. You may return to the gallery. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I call upon Robert Spielman to join us at the table? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rob Spielman and I live in Canterbury. I speak in support of this proposal for the special control overlay, and I have a number of queries to ask the officer about those controls.
Mr. Spielman, it isn't a matter of asking questions tonight. You've been given the opportunity to do a 3-minute presentation.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll make my 3-minute presentation about that then. In that presentation, in that control overlay, how do we protect the fabric of what's left and stop any further deterioration? And if the current owner is required to rebuild, how do we make them do it? And if those controls are in place and passed and the minister agrees to them, does that pass to any future owners, or does it stay with the single owner that owns it now?
We might take those as comments rather than...
Take those as comments, please, and we are strongly in acceptance of this proposal. That's
Thank you
all I
very
have
much
to say.
indeed. If you'd like to remain in your seat.
I'd just like to ask a question, a procedural question. Clearly, the Speaker has some questions that he would like asked. It would not seem unreasonable that he uses his time to ask some questions and they can be responded to by officers, or am I incorrect? Is it an unnecessary restriction on what he's allowed to say?
This is not question time, as you know,
No,
Councillor.
this is a procedural question.
You'd be quite at your liberty to put the questions for him as we move forward. So would you like to ask some questions of Councillor, either Mr. Spielman now?
No, I'm simply asking a procedural question about how we present at the UPDC here, and the Speaker has some questions they'd like to put to Council, and I would like an understanding in relation to the meeting procedures and whether that's an unreasonable request. I don't see it as an unreasonable request.
Shortly, officers will have the opportunity to comment on matters arising. The questions or comments that were made tonight will be open.
Sorry, Chair. My question is a procedural one about the management of this meeting and whether a Speaker can use their time to ask a question, or whether we're going to rule that out of order.
We take this as a procedural point. It's not really. Thank you, Mr. Wee. Councillor Franco, we understand from the governance rules that any speaker is permitted to ask questions, but an answer is not required in this particular forum at this time. But we will, again, note them as questions if you so choose, or comments, and then the officers will be given an opportunity in a moment to comment on matters arising.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bigger.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Spielman. I suppose just as a point of clarification then, based on the kinds of questions that you did ask, and you said you were speaking strongly in favour of the officer's recommendation. Can I just clarify then that, for instance, when you asked the question about whether or not what's currently left of the house would be protected, that is your way of expressing that you want it to be protected, is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and it will deteriorate further without any protection from weather and structural support.
And also, just following up your other question, which was about whether or not any kind of a control placed on the house would be passed on where the property would stay with the house rather than the owner. I presume, again, that your assumption, your view is that it should.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. There are no more questions from the councillors. If you'd like to return to the gallery. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now move to Julia Mulhauser.
Good evening. I'm Julie Mulhauser of Canterbury and welcome this opportunity to speak in favour of the specific control overlay incorporated document that's presented tonight and commend the council for doing this promptly. I too have a concern that the remaining fabric be preserved in the intervening time before future development occurs.
Can everyone hear that? Maybe draw your microphone a bit towards you.
Did you hear that? Sorry.
Yeah.
And so I too share a concern that the remaining building fabric is at risk in the intervening time between now and when future development occurs that has that specific control order that applies. That's it.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Ms. Mulhauser? There are none. You may return to the gallery. Thank you very much. I'll now call on Jane Oldham to join us at the table.
Good evening, Jane Oldham, Camberwell.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank officers and councillors for their continued effort, time towards the reconstruction. Shenley Croft, until December 2020, was highly intact and well maintained. This special control overlay is simply seeking reconstruction to that December 2020 state to ensure that Shenley Croft's unique heritage significance to Boroondara is not lost forever. Councillors' interest and support on this reconstruction is widespread. Many in the community have already expressed their support to BHGAP. MPs, federal and state, are closely following developments. The Royal Historical Society of Victoria requested an in-person update at its committee meeting last week from BHGAP. Other councils are looking to Boroondara's leadership as it pioneers the use of Section 6B of the Planning and Environment Act. The National Trust just last week published an article on the wider importance of council's response to the neglect the Shenley Croft endured over the last 3 years and demolition by fire. Finally, for the owner of 7 Mangara and owners of heritage places across Boroondara, this special control overlay provides timely clarity on council's commitment to conserving heritage fabric even when tragedy strikes. The SCO makes clear council's expectations on reconstruction and that it be undertaken without undue delay. I strongly encourage you tonight to resolve to support the officer's recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Oldham. Are there any questions from councillors? There aren't. Thank you very much. You may return to the gallery. Our last presenter tonight is Tiny James. If you'd join us at the table.
Good evening, councillors. Tani James, I live in Wood End. I just wanted to show my face again and applaud you all for the vote that you took regarding 7 Mangara Road, my family home. Beyond the decision being so intensely personal, your actions will give real teeth to heritage protection in Boroondara and create a genuine deterrent for other potential acts of commercial vandalism. The heartache of seeing the charred remains of Shenley Croft is still extremely raw, but you can make something good come out of its needless destruction. And as I perhaps inappropriately yelled out at the conclusion of your last meeting, that Notre Dame and Windsor Castle stand as testament as to what is possible and I support the motions before you and salute your officers for their amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. Councillors, are there any questions? There are none. Thank you very much. If you just return to the gallery. That exhausts the submissions tonight. We'll return to the officers for matters arising.
Thanks, Chair. I might just give a little bit of an overview for this particular control that's being proposed by the Council and being put forward to the Minister for Planning and how it works. Just so we've got a little bit of context, and then I'll see if Marie Sheriff has some additional comments to add in response to the submissions. The special control overlay is a bespoke overlay. It is designed specifically in response to a circumstance where a property has been left to deteriorate or has been damaged or destroyed unlawfully. And it was a specific approach that's been put together by the state government, but has yet to be tested in any formal way. This is the exact scenario where this sort of control is to be used, and this is an absolute pertinent example where we need to pursue this for the future of heritage effectively in the state. What a special control overlay does, like many, many overlays in the planning scheme, is actually prevent certain things from happening. So it will prevent further demolition of the dwelling. It prevents that from happening unless certain things happen. But the SCO in this case, which is unusual in planning controls, goes a little bit further. It actually requires the reinstatement of the dwelling, the reconstruction of the dwelling within a certain period of time, and they're outlined in the detailed control document that's been put forward. If the landowner does not meet those requirements for the reconstruction, then it is open to council, or in fact open to any other party, to pursue enforcement action. And that can be in a variety of ways, through a VCAT order, for example, for that to happen. And if that VCAT order is not complied with, then that's a breach of court. There's a series of enforcement steps that can be undertaken to ensure that the landowner repairs and implements the expectations of the control overlay. And it isn't a simple matter for the owner to sell the property and wipe out or remove the expectation that goes with it. The control goes with the property. So if the property changes hands, then the new owner will inherit the obligation expectations of that control overlay. So it's a pretty progressive, sound and strong overlay that would be put in place. It is an important matter for us to pursue to ensure that we send a message that property owners are not able to benefit financially or for the future development of their property, either through a deliberate act or even through an act that they had no control of, but they should not benefit from that act where it's impacted or destroyed a heritage property, and that's what this proposal seeks to address. I don't know whether Ms. Sheriff has any further points to add.
Through you, Chair, just one in relation to, I think maybe wasn't quite touched on, but about whether the SCO continues to apply to the site if there's a change in ownership. And yes, the SCO will continue to apply regardless of any change in ownership until it's satisfied. I believe that was it.
Thank you very much. Are there, Councillor Hollingsworth, your question?
Just a question, thank you, Mr. Chair. For Ms. Sheriff or whoever chooses to answer, there was a question from a presenter about the SCO and whether or not it's a blanket control over heritage properties that are in disrepair. My understanding is this is a case specific, is that correct? Yes, I just wanted to clarify that, thank you.
That's correct. This is site specific only, it's not a blanket.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. A question I have, and it's more a curiosity to try and understand the control. 4.1A of the control says no planning permit is required for ... the reconstruction of the dwelling. Yes? And so I'm curious why we've excluded that. I can see in the latter part of the proposed control that there are a whole series of mechanisms in place to ensure, and they're very comprehensive, and I'm satisfied with them, so I'm not questioning them, a whole series of requirements to ensure that what would be reconstructed would be appropriate and in accordance with the will of council, should we approve this. But why did we do it that way rather than perhaps many of these things would normally be captured in a planning permit? And I was just curious about the separation and that strategic approach to it. Thank you.
Thanks. Again, through yourself, Chair. This is the way that a special control overlay works. It effectively sets a really clear and strong framework which in effect becomes part of the planning scheme. Now, by making it part of the planning scheme, there is a very clear expectation for the various approvals that need to be put in place to meet that requirement. It means that there's no need for a planning permit process, but it also means that there's not the discretion and the grey areas or opportunities to go to VCAT around the planning permit process.
Thank you.
Councillor Sinfield.
If questions have been exhausted, Chair, I'm ready to move an alternate motion.
They do appear to be, so if you'd like to proceed with your motion at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. On the screen behind you, Chair, is an alternate motion which is in keeping with the officer's recommendation. It's just been simplified.
Do we have a seconder for this motion? Councillor Addis, I think your light hip was hit first. Do you want to fight over that one?
Happy to second.
Thank you very much. Is anyone proposed to the motion as it currently appears on the screen? You?
Opposed? Opposed as opposed to proposed?
Did I say that, did I? Thank you for correcting me. Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Bigger, my apologies. Is anyone opposed to the motion as it currently appears? No, there's not. So, Councillor Sinfield, if you'd like to speak to your motion, it'd be appreciated.
Thank you, Chair. Tonight we take the next step in a process regarding the individually significant arts and crafts inspired landmark Edwardian villa, Shenley Croft, a magnificent property that stood in the Golden Mile precinct of Canterbury at 7 to 9 Mangara Road. This draft incorporated document that officers have presented tonight seeks to restore and reinstate the beautiful heritage home designed by prominent architect John Edmund Burke and built in 1905. This acquits the resolution of this committee on the 5th of February, which sought to bring forward the draft incorporated document for consideration. Once again, we seek ministerial intervention in accordance with Section 20 of the Planning Environment Act 1987 to apply the SCO to this parcel of land containing the charred remnants of an iconic dwelling in Canterbury. I'm given some comfort, but from my discussions with officers prior to tonight, that the balance of the building does remain protected by the existing Heritage Overlay 391. A submitter remarked a few weeks ago that if Windsor Castle, damaged by fire in 1992, and Notre Dame, damaged by fire in 2019, can be restored, then so too can Shenley Croft. So through this motion, I call upon the Minister for Planning to send a strong message that we value our history and we seek to preserve it. And we seek to regulate or and we seek to regulate or prohibit the development of land on which there is or was a heritage building. So I commend this motion to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Whilst there is no opposition to this motion tonight, Councillor Addis, would you like to speak?
No, look, I think everyone here supports very much what officers are doing and thanks them for it. Thank you.
Councillor Sinfield, you're happy if we move and put the motion? All of those in favour of the motion as it's currently shown. Is there anyone against? None. I declare this motion carried. Thank you. Great. Well, we move to general business. Are there any items of general business that need to be raised tonight? Gosh, that's good. Urgent business? Confidential business? Thank you. Before I close the meeting, I want to thank you all that have joined us this evening for participating in this meeting, and I declare the meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting now closed. Thank you.